All right, welcome back to Chapter 10 of our church history class. Here we're looking at the chapter titled Bloodshed and Evangelization. Evangelization meaning the bringing of the gospel to other people, particularly those who haven't heard it before, so to kind of gospelize the world. So we're going to talk a little bit about the bloodshed, the wars that break out here after we have just moved through kind of the Protestant Reformation, and some of the wars and so forth that break out in the midst of all of that. We talked a little bit about that last week, but we're going to dive into that a little bit more today. And so as we look at the wars of religion, kind of continuing those from the last class, some really important and wars that you may have heard of in the past break out really under the flags of Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, these different Protestant denominations. So that's why they're typically referred to as wars of religion. Okay, so one of the wars that you have breaking out is Spain remains pretty thoroughly Catholic throughout most of this time of turmoil here. So the Spanish Armada, you may have heard of that phrase before. Catholic Spain under the at the moment King Philip II tries to go back into England and help reconquer it and make it Catholic again, and from Elizabeth I. But the Spanish Armada is driven away by a much smaller English fleet, and so that's always been a celebrated battle, of course, for English peoples, the people of England, over the Spanish Armada there. It was a great military upset, if you will. You also have the 30 Years' War breaking out, where you have Calvinists and Lutherans and Catholics. They're all kind of in various places fighting for control of Europe, of course. And you have smaller wars and violence breaking out in England and Ireland, all over the place, really. And the main point of that is that no one was safe, right? There was it just wasn't. It was always turmoil. There was a lot of violence breaking out. And so forth, and it was a very unfortunate time. I think it's really important. I just want to make a little bit of a comment about this topic of wars of religion, because I think it's super important. A lot of people will say, look, when you make religion, religion is the cause, in fact, let me say it that way, religion is the cause of all of the wars and violence that are out there. If we could just get rid of religion, is what a lot of secularists and atheist people say. Maybe you've heard this at your schools and so forth. If we get rid of religion, all of the problems will go away. Everyone will start to get along again. That religion is framed a lot of times as the problem, right? And that's why there's war, right? So you have Osama bin Laden, who is religious, and you have the Catholics that are religious fighting and doing these wars, and the Protestants and Calvinists, they're all fighting because of their religion. And so we just need to get rid of religion is the argument. And so I want to look at this argument here back to that, against that notion. It's really important for us. It's been made by many other people, but I just wanted to point you to a book called The Atheist Delusions by a real sharp writer, David Bentley Hart. And he just kind of destroys a lot of the atheist myths that are out there today. And one of his chapters is devoted to wars on the wars of religion that we've been talking about, that kind of break out throughout Europe in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, he says this, first of all, and you might not be able to even read this, I'm not sure, but I'll obviously read it to you and break it down a little bit. Okay, there is something inherently absurd about speaking about these wars as wars of religion, as though they were fought principally over matters of doctrine. The mercenary armies, whose predatory brutality to the towns and villages of the German states were scarcely motivated by disputes over transubstantiation. His point being, right, that these wars were not about religion per se, right? They were not about doctrine. They were not about any of those kinds of things, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. So it's really important, first of all, to remember that it's not about, for these Catholics, Calvins, Lutherans, everybody, all of these people where this violence is breaking out in Europe, right? Wasn't principally actually about doctrine, right? The people that were fighting in that regard were hardly ever motivated by dogma in any way. This is a really important point that he goes on to make, right? Every age has known wars and cruelty and injustice, oppression, murderous zeal, and murderous indifference, right? But midway through the 20th century, Western society, so he's talking here about our culture in our own day, right? So the 1900s, the 2000s, our society had become so inured to the idea of war as a total conflict between one entire people and another, that even liberal democracies, so even countries like America, right, and countries like England and France, as we find them in our own day, did not even think twice about bombing cities from the air or using incendiary or nuclear devices to incinerate tens of thousands of civilians, sometimes for only the vaguest of military objectives. Here's the point here, right? What he's saying, what he's establishing is, look, back then, okay, in the wars of religion, they weren't really fighting. Yes, there was fighting being done under the flags of Catholicism, Islam and the Crusades, Calvinists, Lutherans in Europe, the Spanish Armada versus, Protestant England, okay? But he's saying they weren't fighting over doctrine. And now we oftentimes pretend to tell ourselves that once we remove state and religion apart, as we did in the 1800s in the United States and France and in England and so many other places, now that we have separation of church and state and have had that for about 250 years in most of Europe, right? What he's pointing out here is that the wars have gotten way worse. And not just because of the technology. The way we fight these wars, now that we are freed from religion in so many ways, our state is not affected by religion. We are in some ways a religious people, right? But the state has been separated from the church in that regard, has been separated from Lutheranism or from Calvinism or from Catholicism, right? Those things are no longer in play. And what's happened is, as he's saying, things have gotten way worse, right? There were always wars breaking out, even when there was no religion, right? Even when there was no sort of Christianity wasn't even on the scene. There were lots of wars breaking out, right? Even back then, before Christianity, right? Before religion becomes kind of closer to the state as it does with Christianity. And this is the other point. The wars of the 1900s and 2000s have been the deadliest of all, and those were not wars of religion. Those were wars where so everybody that's saying, we just got to get rid of religion and then wars will stop. We've done that, and the wars have gotten worse because they've allowed us to now that we're not operating under any kind of religious pretense, I'm now dropping nuclear bombs. I'm burning alive, the missiles and all these kinds of things. I mean, the wars have gotten way, way worse, and not just because of the technology, right? So he really blows this idea up, and I think both of those points are important to make. Which will be remembered as the most brutal century, the century of the wars of religion or the 1900s, where we had the Communist Revolution, which had nothing to do with religion, World War I, which had nothing to do with religion, World War II, which had nothing to do with religion, Mao's communism, which definitely had nothing to do with religion, right? All of these things kind of remove religion. Hitler was removing religion. Communist Revolution removes religion. And what do we see there? We see hundreds of millions of people dying. Right? Hundreds of millions of people dying in the midst of this stuff, where we got rid of religion, right? So yes, are religious people perfect? No. But does Christianity, here for a moment, does Christianity help make people better overall? Yes. Does Christianity help make people overall more civilized? Yes. What happens when we remove Christianity from our we don't have that affecting us anymore as a people? We find the bloodshed goes up a hundredfold, right? Way, way more than that. Okay. He said, he said the state, when you separate it from religion, it really begins to be about two things. The absolute power of the state, which we're seeing in our own day, and total war, right? There's no more checks on war. There's no more... for the most part, in a lot of places, it's just become this. So anyways, we've kind of established that. I think it's a really great point that he's making here about the wars of religion. So when you're in some kind of freshman honors class in college and they're talking about history and they say, look how bad the wars of religion are because Protestants and Catholics are fighting, it's important to come back and remember these things. In this book, Atheist Delusions, I really encourage you to pick it up. It has a lot of great rebuttals to all these different things that are thrown at Christianity really falsely in so many ways. Okay. thankfully, this era is not marked only by the wars that are happening in Europe. Okay, I think what happened is, to some extent, you see at the same time, you see this great zeal to go out and bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. You see these great missionaries coming forward, right? And to some extent, okay, now that these wars are going on in Europe, and you have kind of Christianity, the lines have basically been marked out, right? Like pretty much everybody in Europe at this point has heard about Jesus Christ and the gospel. Now, some of them are Protestants, some are Calvinists, some are Lutherans, some are Catholics, but pretty much everybody in Europe got to that point where, okay, we've heard the good news of the gospel, right? And so there was this great desire, I think people recognized, we now need to go take this out to the other peoples of the world, even places that aren't on the map, right? And so you see these great missionary people rising up. One of them is the patron saint of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, St. Francis Xavier. He is credited and sometimes is thought to be maybe the person who baptized the most people in the history of the church, right? He travels to Japan, he travels to India. His desire was to make it to China at some point, although I believe he never actually made it to China. Matteo Ricci was another great missionary who made it to China and really helps bring about this great conversion. The Philippines, was evangelized by European missionaries and now is one of the most Catholic countries in the world. And so you have this great outreach to the ends of the earth where the gospel is being brought by European peoples to those who had not heard the gospel yet. And the Jesuits were really well known. They're an order that's still around, of course, and they are, brought it to North America and South America, Africa. We'll see a little bit here too. In Africa, Africa is also evangelized, although, as we saw on our map, I mean, the northern part of Africa there in Egypt and all of that kind of stuff is really settled and is evangelized right from the very beginning of the church, right, as some of the apostles even make their way into Africa. But now we're seeing this new wave, this effort to evangelize all of Africa, right? And so many people gave their lives in bringing the gospel to all these various regions of Africa, right? There's a lot of different ways in which it's received, and sometimes, of course, all the missionaries were really risking their lives in bringing that gospel to people who'd never heard it before. And also what we see, I think, is in Africa, and also as we'll see in South America as well, you see this real problem of maybe sometimes on the heels of or part of this bringing the gospel to these places, there was also this attempt to colonize that area by the government back home, right? So if it's Portugal, right? So there's an effort maybe to bring the gospel to this place, but then, or maybe Portugal, the government comes first, the state there comes first, but whatever it was, sometimes tied up in the bringing of the gospel to these places, you also have this problem of it being settled in kind of the native culture sometimes being affected. Now, I would say, too, that doesn't really, I would say that for the vast majority of that doesn't fall on the missionaries themselves, right? Because the missionaries themselves were totally content to work in the midst of the people who were already there. They didn't say we need to mine this and we need to make profits off of these people and we need to set up slave camps. We need to settle and we need to build buildings here and we need to make it European here. The missionaries didn't believe that. The missionaries, the vast majority of them were there just to bring the gospel and perfectly content to not make it Europe. Right? They were perfectly content to bring Christianity into the culture amidst the people. And I think it's really important, right? Like to make sure that we know that when we're going to bring the gospel to anybody, that's what has to motivate us. We have to be motivated by a desire to bring something to them, but not to dominate them, right? Not to control them, not to manipulate them. So a lot of these places in Africa and in South America end up being sort of colonized at the same time by the Europeans, right? Not the missionaries, but the Europeans themselves. So we don't think of that as a good thing, obviously. That stuff still goes on today. We still are kind of pumping our European ideas about what they should be doing as African people or South American people and so we're still doing that, even though we think sometimes that we're not. We are as a culture, and so we not the church, but I think the church is very adaptable again to whatever is going on in the local cultures. But the government, and some of the ideas sometimes that are being pumped in to Africa, South, and other countries is still sometimes a sort of colonization is still going on. Although we've pulled back, and the countries themselves are not controlling these other nations anymore as much. They're still trying to do that sometimes through ideas and through what we're trying to sell to them and so forth. Okay, but anyways. Again, the same thing goes for Latin America. You have the story of Hernando Cortez, of course, and the really strained relationship that's there with the Mexican people, the natives, the Aztecs, all those that are there. There's a lot of violence. Unfortunately, sometimes there was a motivation by some of those who were coming for gold, for money. There was, again, a lot of murder, a lot of putting to death of native peoples, which, of course, again, is just very unfortunate. That was not, Cortez was not coming to evangelize, per se. The missionaries were not doing that, but unfortunately there was that greed element alongside sometimes the bringing of the gospel that we don't celebrate in any way. King Charles V and Philip II of Spain did have a desire to spread Christianity, but again, sometimes alongside that, again, came bad things, violence and destroying of peoples. North America, our continent, is a very fascinating mix of evangelization because you have it coming to our country from a lot of different directions. You have Catholicism. Normally, Catholicism first comes to a particular country kind of through one path. But for North America, it's really interesting because you have it coming from lots of different directions. You have it coming from kind of the Canadian area where you have St. Isaac Jogues and John de Brebeuf, two Jesuits who were martyred for their faith eventually. They come down the St. Lawrence River out of the north a little bit and bring it into the country and evangelize a lot of the Native American peoples. You have the Spanish and Mexican Catholicism, kind of coming up through Mexico, and through the south there into Texas and California. You have this Portuguese and Spanish Catholicism that kind of comes into the country through Florida. You have colonized Catholics where you have like the state of Maryland, for example. You can see Mary's land. Out of the 13 colonies, a lot of them were sort of religious denominations, at least in some ways. And so Maryland, Mary's land, after our Blessed Mother, was one of those places where a lot of the Catholics ended up, particularly if they were fleeing persecution in England. And so you have those English Catholics that are coming over and establishing themselves in Maryland. You have Blessed Junipero Serra, who helped Native Americans in California specifically. So you have a lot of different ways in which Catholicism kind of comes into our country, so which is this really unique mix that we see. And each country has its own unique mix of the ways in which and the people that brought the gospel to them. But just interesting to think about all those different directions in which it feeds into our country. Okay, so our questions for today. Who is the patron saint of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis? Number 2, why did the Spanish send an armada to attack England? Number 3, what is the Catholic state for English Catholic refugees in the original 13 colonies? And number 4, if someone said to you the only thing good religion has done is cause wars and give people things to fight about, how would you answer that question? Okay, so if someone accused religion of bringing about all of these wars and violence, how might you answer that question? Okay, that's all we have for today. I hope and pray that you are doing well. And again, if you ever need anything, if I can do any spiritual direction for you, or if you ever need to chat about anything, know that I'm always available. And hope and pray that you're doing well. Please let me know if I can help. God bless.